Hello there, I'm Chuck Todd, and welcome to Meet the Press Reports, where we take a look beyond the day-to-day headlines to dive deep into a single subject in American politics. And today, that subject is QAnon. No, you can't ignore it. So what is it? Where did it come from? And is it unique to the Trump era? Here's what we do know. QAnon is a blanket conspiracy theory that one of our experts today describes as the granddaddy of conspiracies because it sort of includes all of them and essentially gobbles up all other conspiracy theories in its path. And it's more a religion these days than a political movement, and we're going to get to that in a little while as well. But there is a very dark and dangerous component that people on all sides of the political spectrum have to be wary of. And that has to do with the fact that the American political system, we've been here before. From the early days of this country's founding, there have been government skeptics turned conspiracy theorists. But until very recently, these folks weren't armed with the tool that they now use to propagate their message: social media. On that front, there are signs of good news. A number of platforms have attempted to crack down or ban QAnon, including new moves from Facebook this week. But the most important defining characteristic about QAnon is that it is a political conspiracy theory. It's chiefly a pro-Trump one. QAnon followers consider President Trump their savior. And as the president chooses not to turn away any supporter, it's becoming mainstream. The Republican Party now needs to acknowledge its existence because it has a QAnon problem. Will the party rid its ranks of QAnon, or will it let it get mainstreamed by turning a blind eye and letting it flourish?
Do you believe there's a ring of high-profile politicians who are kidnapping and sacrificing children?
I do believe that.
We don't sit behind a TV to see what's going on with the media lying to us every minute. We need to go out and find out what the truth is.
It also believes that there's a cannibalistic ring of pedophiles.
And if that comes to be true,
has its extremists.
I didn't say it couldn't be true, but I didn't say it could be true.
QAnon, once a fringe phenomenon, is now exploding online, a symptom of how susceptible America is to a conspiracy theory, supercharged by the power of social media.
It began in the outreaches of the internet on a chat board called 4chan in October 2017. And it alleged that there was a kind of group of satanic conspirators buried deep in the US government who were working to undermine the US nation, and that Donald Trump was battling these conspirators.
The Atlantic's Adrienne LaFrance has spent months studying QAnon and its shadowy origins.
This mysterious figure, Q, is someone with military intelligence who's secretly working with Donald Trump to take down high-profile Democrats who are in private abusing children.
QAnon has now become this sort of goulash or casserole of all the various conspiracy theories out there.
Kim Holberg says her fiancé left her after being drawn into the QAnon conspiracy online.
The anti-vaxxers and the chemtrail people and the flat earthers and the Spygate people and Obamagate and et cetera, all of that has now found a home.
According to analysis from Dynata on QAnon supporters, 63% are white, 58% are male, 55% have a household income of less than $75,000 a year, and just 30% have a bachelor's degree or equivalent. And 58% are supporting Donald Trump for president.
It is at its core a pro-Trump conspiracy theory.
I've heard these are people that love our country and they just don't like seeing it. So I don't know really anything about it other than they do supposedly like me.
The president has retweeted QAnon-linked accounts hundreds of times and boosted congressional candidates who supported it, like Georgia Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is running now virtually unopposed and who Mr. Trump has called a future Republican star.
There's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take this global cable of Satan-worshiping pedophiles out, and I think we have the president to do it.
Crux of the theory is this belief that you are secretly saving the world from this satanic cult of pedophiles and cannibals. Does that sound like something you are behind?
Well, I haven't heard that, but is that supposed to be a bad thing or a good thing? I mean, you know, if I can help save the world from problems, I'm willing to do it.
Trump campaign ads have featured supporters with QAnon paraphernalia, and the Republican Party has grappled with whether and how to distance itself.
Big mistake. This is a group of nuts and kooks, and he ought to disavow them.
But dozens of candidates, nearly all Republicans, have voiced support. This month, the House voted to condemn QAnon.
Resolution is adopted.
But 17 Republicans and one independent voted against the resolution. Central to the QAnon cult is a loss of faith in government. More than 60% of QAnon supporters believe there soon will be a civil war in the United States.
It's a force that erodes our shared reality at a time when divisions in our country are already extraordinarily stark.
Propelling it are racist and anti-Semitic tropes. Just 33% completely agree that Senator Kamala Harris is a natural-born citizen, eligible for the presidency. And the FBI has labeled QAnon a domestic terror threat.
We have had cases that properly predicated cases involving violence where people have been motivated by some of those conspiracy theories.
In 2017, a North Carolina man was sentenced to 4 years in prison after firing a gun in a D.C. pizza restaurant where he was looking for a non-existent child trafficking ring run by Democrats, all an internet lie. In 2018, a QAnon supporter was arrested after a standoff on Hoover Dam. He faces terrorism charges. Now QAnon accounts have become central to the spread of disinformation on the coronavirus.
In the middle of March this year, at the same time pretty much as lockdowns were coming in throughout the world, conversation about QAnon online skyrocketed.
According to Dynata, nearly half of QAnon supporters say the coronavirus isn't real, and half say 5G cellular technology is responsible for its spread. QAnon accounts have pushed the conspiracy theory that President Trump is not sick with the virus, but carrying out secret missions in an imagined war.
I believe that President Trump was approached by military, and it's been a plan that's been in place for decades.
So joining me now are former FBI special agent and NBC News national security contributor Clint Watts, executive editor of The Atlantic, Adrienne LaFrance, and our own NBC News correspondent Morgan Radford, who you just saw there conducting an interview with one of those Q followers. Welcome all of you to Meet the Press Reports. Morgan, I want to start with your experience, particularly with that gentleman, because I'm sure you feel the same way that I do, although I apologize if I'm speaking for you, which is, it just, like, how is it that people can believe? I mean, it's so out there. And I guess, you know, I'm watching you, and at times that guy looks like he's going to laugh or not. Did you get the sense he was serious or winking and nodding, or what was your reaction?
100% serious, Chuck. I mean, these are people who believe it. You say it's out there, and it may sound out there to you or me or people watching this segment, but it's not as out there as we think in terms of the reaction, the public reaction, the number of people who believe in this. This is a phenomenon that's almost a classic case of rise and reaction. You know, when we were first reporting on this, like when you saw that there were just so few people who really understood what QAnon even meant. And yet you would find these groups of people who would literally travel to Trump rallies together because their belief was so strong. But even in March of this year, just 3% of people said that they had heard a lot or read about QAnon. Now that number is 37%. And when they surveyed Republicans, 1 in 3 Republicans now believe that QAnon is mostly true. And so now you're seeing this reaction where this thing has gone from online to offline, from voters to now candidates. So you now have people who are candidates who say that even if they don't believe everything that QAnon says, they essentially say, this is a voting bloc, and we can't afford to dismiss them. So while it seems out there, it may not be as far off as you think. There are people beside you, next to you, in the grocery store with you who believe this.
And Clint, I guess that's the struggle here, and I think perhaps why some in official Washington and official Silicon Valley have struggled to crack down, because you don't know what is just a kooky thing on the internet versus what's dangerous on the internet.
That's right, Chuck. That's always the challenge. The problem is once it grows. So just like we were talking about there, it went from 3% to 30% in terms of awareness. It's grown over the last 2 years, and you and I have talked about it several times. It's grown exponentially, and that's only possible really because of social media. You could not generate such content, you could not create such conspiracies, and you could not advance them to such a scale without social media. The problem is once it hits a critical mass, once it's this sizable, that it starts to take over the political movement. It is now becoming part of a political belief system. What differentiates it from past movements we've seen, think back to Occupy or the Tea Party, both from roughly the same period. They organized collectively, but they had a set of an agenda that they wanted to advance politically. QAnon doesn't. QAnon literally believes that the federal government is been infiltrated and they need to almost destroy it at times. You'll hear Second Civil War, bringing the deep state down. That literally is saying we're going to get rid of the state. So if these people are elected to power, what is their agenda or what might they do? And I think that's where the overlap with extremism, the FBI's warnings get really concerning.
Well, and the fact is, I want to put up, these are just some headlines from the last 2 years of where QAnon believers took matters into their own hands. You had one, we brought up the Hoover Dam. It was somehow the mob and QAnon ended up linked to the same thing. A suspect was radicalized. It turned out it wasn't having to do with the mob, even though they thought it did. And Clint, how much of a problem now is QAnon as a violent, actor or an instigator?
I think what's fascinating about QAnon is it's really the amalgamation of everything in the conspiracy world. And so as it grows, what I always tell people is you have a base of people who are just interested in it. You have another subset of that are real supporters or believers. Then you have a small subset of any one of these groups that blows up that believes the only way to achieve the objectives of the movement is to resort to violence. That might be a small fringe, but as the group grows, that small fringe becomes larger and larger. Just today, we're talking about Michigan militia overlap with a Wolverine militia, overlapping possibly with other militia groups out of state, likely overlapping with conspiracies. So when you start putting all of this together, it snowballs into a dangerous time whenever you have politicians running for office and you have a president that won't disavow them going into Election Day who says that it's rigged and you may need to take it in your own hands or you may need to watch what's going on at polling places.
Adrienne LaFrance, you have, and I remember when you wrote this piece because it really sort of sent chills down my spine because you said, hey, this is more than just a conspiracy theory. This is more than a fringe group. This is turning into a religion. Explain why you've compared it to a religion.
This is something that surprised me in my own reporting. I set out to understand who would possibly believe this thing and why, and whether there really were true believers or whether, to your first question, people were just sort of winking or nodding at this thing, knowing it was ridiculous. And what I found, and which really surprised me, the more people I talked to who really believe it, that they were deriving this sense of deep, almost spiritual serenity from their belief in Q. And if you look at the way that people find community, the way they interpret the sort of foundational text of these Q drops, it more and more just began to resemble a baby religion born on the internet.
Adrienne, is there a, for lack of a better term, a stereotype of a QAnon follower by age or by income or by affiliation?
I think I saw some of the data you put up earlier in the segment, which was really interesting. And it's hard to track because we don't have a registry of Q believers. And it's very hard to know among the sort of Q activity online what is genuine versus bot networks versus anything else. But the sense, just from where you find Q folks out in the real world, often at Trump rallies, you see a lot of overlap between Trump's base and Q's base. And that's because the QAnon is, at its very core, a pro-Trump conspiracy theory.
All right. Adrienne, Morgan, and Clint, I want to pause here. We've talked about QAnon, the current problem. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, these conspiracy theories have actually always reverberated under the surface of American politics. And it rises to the mainstream every so often. And we deal with it. So we asked a few historians and experts if QAnon really is unique, or is it just a modern manifestation of a worldview that's always been here?
The United States is a deeply conspiratorial nation. It has had conspiracy theories right from the American Revolution all the way through to the 20th century into the 21st century.
The deep state idea has been around for a long time, and you could find instances going back decades where people were talking about the deep state.
In the town of Norban, Missouri, is the headquarters of the Minutemen, an extreme right organization arming itself to save the country from its internal enemies.
We believe that our nation, and especially our government even, has been deeply infiltrated by communists and communist sympathizers.
So this conspiracy theory, it dates back to the Middle Ages, right? We can trace it to the 80s with satanic panic or blood libel with the anti-Semitic Jewish conspiracy.
When Kennedy was killed in 1963, the conspiracies surrounding that, and then the Vietnam War, and the real conspiracy that was Watergate, there was a general increase in distrust of American expertise, American authority, government legitimacy. There was a kind of proliferation of conspiracy theories that came out of that.
Many of these groups in the past, like the John Birch Society and certainly the Lyndon LaRouche group, have believed in conspiracy theories.
There is the John Birch Society with its publication, American Opinion.
What's different now is the connectivity and the amplification of social media. So before, when you might have a couple of crazy people in a town that think this insane thing, now what social media algorithms have done is on YouTube it said, oh, you believe in chemtrails or that 9/11 was an inside job? Here, let me show you this crazy conspiracy theory. And it leads you down these trails.
I think there is always fertile ground for conspiracy thinking in the United States politics and U.S. history. This notion of American exceptionalism, that because America sees itself as a special nation with a special mission, there's always the search for the kind of internal enemy or the enemy who will bring the nation down.
If you were to look at Kennedy conspiracy theories, for example, there isn't just one conspiracy theory, there are numerous. So all sorts of different actors have been accused of taking part in that. With QAnon, that idea has been put on steroids, where all Q really puts out is this basic idea that there's a deep state that's perhaps trafficking children or is up to other things that are really no good. But then the clues Q puts out allow followers to go anywhere they want with it. So it really is a choose your own adventure game where people can pick whatever enemies they don't like, they can make up whatever crimes that they might be involved in, and they can make whatever predictions they want about what's going to happen tomorrow.
All right, so let's bring back Clint, Adrian, and Morgan, and I guess I want to center our conversation of, okay, how do we eradicate or, I guess, deprogram when it comes to QAnon? With the John Birch Society, mainstream Republicans and conservatives, most famously William F. Buckley at National Review, basically banished the John Birch Society from the conservative movement. And that worked back then. There was no internet to do that. This Republican Party hasn't necessarily done that with one voice, but Clint Watts, in this age of social media, if the Republican Party said we want no part of QAnon and Donald Trump said it, would that make it go away?
It won't make it go away entirely, but it would help dramatically in terms of this. Part of the reason this continues is because political opportunism has led people to continue to advance it, or as Q would say, he's signaling, or it's a code. They go into his tweets and they identify certain things that essentially suggest that he supports it. But if the president were to come out, and all of the Republican leadership and Democrats for that matter too, and say, this is complete nonsense. I support the intelligence community. I support the federalist system. I support the government. There's nothing to it. It would put a huge dent into it. But I think even further on, it would still try and continue for a while. But ultimately, these things do tend to burn themselves out. And sadly, in some cases, it's when reality collides with the conspiracy and it is disproven. And that can be in very dangerous ways, like not believing in wearing a mask, or that the government's under the control of pedophiles when it turns out it's not, or you have an armed sort of uprising or revolt. And the rest of the group turns and says, wait, we're not part of this violence. And it begins to implode on itself.
Morgan Radford, one of the ways that Q has tried to keep itself, mainstream itself, has been through the hashtag Save the Children. And in fact, a lot of of groups that that actually work on trying to stop child sex trafficking, which is a real problem, have been infiltrated by Q. And what are they doing about this?
It's hard to combat. Right, Chuck? I mean, that's part of the problem because you can't always see it. And ultimately, it kind of goes back to your previous question. This is about community, right? This is a modern opportunity for a very old motivation. So I don't think that this is something that would necessarily go away, but it's something that might change its form. I mean, think about how many times you and I have been on your show talking about the reports we've done on white supremacists, on anti-Semites, and then now Q. These are very closely related things that ultimately come down to a sense of community. Every time I talk to one of these guys, a guy who left the KKK, he said he did it because of community. When I talk to the QAnon supporters, they say this is a community because only we have the correct information. Only we have the truth. And make no mistake, Chuck, this particular vertical of belief is a Trump-era phenomenon. This is something that started only 1 year after he took office. And you see parallels to his presidency, right, in this belief system, a belief system that says, don't trust the media. There are bad guys and there are good guys. We have enemies. We're the good guys and we're here to stop the bad ones. This almost religious notion, as Adrian mentioned, of dark versus light. And so that's why it's so hard, to your point, of these organizations who want to stop them from infiltrating. Because how do you combat a conspiracy theorist, Chuck? I mean, even when I'm doing these interviews, right, at these Trump rallies, and you say, well, you know, Barack Obama has not been arrested. Does that deter your faith?
Right.
Does it shake your faith in the belief in Q and this anonymous? And they all say no. And so if you're operating from a conspiracy theory, the inherent definition of a conspiracy theory is that you're starting with a conclusion and you're looking for evidence to support that conclusion. So it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and very difficult to stop for precisely that reason, Chuck.
All right, Adrian, so if somebody's watching right now and says, and it's like the woman we featured whose fiance essentially left her for the conspiracy theory. And I have friends or family that have gone down these holes. I've tried to talk them out of it. What do you do? What would you tell somebody if a member, you know, they said, hey, somebody I love is going down this rabbit hole. How do I deprogram?
The people who look at this and have thought about the best way to combat it would tell you, unfortunately, as a journalist, that just presenting people with facts doesn't necessarily matter, but that asking questions does. And so things like how many people would have to be in on this for it to be true? And certainly taking a posture of curiosity rather than combativeness. I think also just approaching people with love and respect while questioning. But the truth is, to Morgan's point, it's really, really hard to sway people who are, you know, plugging this conspiracy theory into a pre-existing worldview and then cherry picking data to support it. So it's a real problem and very difficult to get people to understand what's actually real.
And Adrian, do you think anything that the social media companies do to try to get rid of it would get rid of it? Or is this something that will always find a way until, as Clint put it, it burns itself out?
I think there are things that could help. I also think that for the real social giants, it's too little too late. I mean, you saw Reddit have some success with cracking down on QAnon years ago. Facebook has just started, and we're talking about a 2 billion user platform. So playing whack-a-mole with 2 billion users is not really effective. Also, just before I joined you today, I went and checked on Facebook and was still able to join QAnon groups. So I think we also have to question how effective that maneuver is, and how much of a PR statement it is versus a really effective crackdown.
Clint Watts, Adrian LaFrance, Morgan Radford, thank you for giving us this education on QAnon. It's a bit scary, but I hope folks learning more about it can also act on their own as well. Anyway, thank you. All up ahead, well, I'm obsessed with a fresh new look for the same old nonsense. Finally, I'm obsessed with change. It may be inevitable, but not all of it is good. We've been talking about QAnon during this episode, but we haven't talked about one of its big problems. Not that it's a ludicrous conspiracy theory about a secret cabal of Satan worshiping, human trafficking, baby-eating politicians, but that it's a ludicrous conspiracy theory about a secret cabal of Satan worshiping, human trafficking, baby-eating politicians with a public relations problem. NBC News learned recently that QAnon leaders, yes, they exist, are urging their followers to drop the QAnon label from their online posts because those posts are being blocked. Twitter and now Facebook are increasingly cracking down on QAnon. And that's no good for the conspiracy theory business. So here's what was posted on the message board account at the center of this whole mess. Deploy camouflage, drop all references, read Q, QAnon, etc. to avoid ban/termination. So it appears that one of the most odious corners of the internet is now taking a page from corporate America. When all else fails, rebrand. A new name, a new logo, wipe that tarnished image clean, make people forget. There's a ton of rebranding going on these days. As America faces an ongoing reckoning over centuries of racial injustice, several well-known brands have finally begun to retire names and logos with deep-seated problematic racial connotations. Uncle Ben's, Aunt Jemima, and Cream of Wheat, to name a few. Though it has surely come far too late, these companies have ultimately come to terms with the fact that America cannot and will not abide relics of an unjust past. And they've been forced to do it out in the open. Now that's rebranding, though, for good. It's helping move this country forward even just a little bit. But then there's rebranding for something far, far different. QAnon, cloaking its twisted, dangerous, insidious nonsense in a new secret identity, but still as twisted and dangerous and insidious as ever. So be on the lookout for the new QAnon in social media feeds, proffering the same old bunk with a fresh coat of toxic paint. It would be truly unbelievable if not for so many people believing it. So that's all the time we have for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Join us for our next episode when we're going to look at the war over judges, how the lone unelected branch of government became a political battleground, and why that has a lot more to do with the breakdowns in our other two branches. Thank you for being with us. For Meet the Press Reports, join us on NBC News Now or anytime. Binge away all of our episodes on Peacock right now. Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.